Do you know that one Vietnamese family in Australia transformed a sweaty suburban gym into a multi-million-dollar property stack without a single investor, headline, or viral moment? That's the kind of money we're taking as we take you to this jaw-dropping countdown of the 8 richest Vietnamese families in Australia. Stick around till the end, because the family at number 1 will change your entire perspective of how far migrants can go in Australia. Number 8. The Nguyen family. 2 siblings, 1 market, 2 very different empires. Let's start with a story that Sydney market's insiders love to whisper about, usually somewhere between a 3 a.m. auction and a lukewarm takeaway coffee. It's the kind of story that quietly dismantles the idea that shared beginnings guarantee shared outcomes. Same family, same refugee journey, same produce sheds, but completely different paths to power. The Nguyen family story really has 2 main characters, Frank Nguyen and his sister, Teresa Nguyen. Both arrived in Australia as children in the late 1970s, part of the same refugee wave, growing up in an ecosystem defined by early mornings, cold rooms, forklifts, and prices scribbled on cardboard. But while Frank took the long vertical route, Teresa took the sharp horizontal one. Let's start with Frank, because his story reads like the blueprint for Vietnamese-Australian agribusiness. After arriving in Australia as a boat refugee, Frank didn't jump straight into scale. He started with 7 acres in Kenthurst, NSW. You heard it right, 7 acres. Alongside his wife, Vui, he grew shallots, chilies, and cucumbers, harvesting by hand and selling into markets that barely knew what to do with Asian vegetables at the time. In 1983, they formalized the operation as TV Farms Pty Limited, probably without imagining how far that name would travel. Fast forward a few decades, and TV Farms looks less like a farm and more like a logistics organism. The family now controls or operates over 1,400 acres across NSW, Queensland, and the Northern Territory, deliberately spread across climate zones to hedge weather risk. That land alone represents tens of millions in value. Add farming infrastructure, distribution networks, and direct access to Sydney markets, and you get a vertically integrated machine that eliminates middlemen and stabilizes margins when others panic. Their estimated family wealth sits comfortably between 30 to 50 million Australian dollars, built on assets you can actually touch. Now here's where Teresa's story flips the script. Instead of expanding outward into land and scale, Teresa built inward, focusing on speed, trust, and execution. She also had the option to merge paths with her brother, but decided to scale up individually with a bigger vision. Before Oriental Produce became a name buyers relied on, she spent years doing the unglamorous work: farming, packing, trading, learning how prices move not just week to week, but hour to hour. When she stepped fully into wholesaling, she didn't try to mirror her brother's empire. She built a trader's empire instead, lean, disciplined, and ruthlessly consistent. Oriental Produce specializes in Asian fruits and vegetables, with tight inventory control and fast turnover. Teresa became known for something deceptively simple. She honored prices, even during volatile weeks when others chased quick wins. In produce, that reputation turns into credit. Credit turns into scale. And scale, quietly, turns into wealth. Today, her estimated net worth ranges between 15 to 25 million Australian dollars, with annual revenues plausibly exceeding $10 million purely on reliability and repeat buyers. Operating in a male-dominated market, Teresa's real edge was endurance. She showed up every day, prioritized long-term buyers in Cabramatta, Bankstown, and Western Sydney, and became less of a supplier and more of a fixture. Same family, same roots, 2 different philosophies. But together, the 2 siblings represent the Nguyen family's real legacy. Proof that execution beats inheritance, and that there's more than one way to turn crates and cold rooms into generational wealth. But we're only getting started. Next up is a story that takes us to the world of media buzz, menus, and cultural influence. Number 7. The Chu family, turning Vietnamese street food into an Australian lifestyle brand. If the Nguyen family shows how migrant wealth in Australia can grow quietly, Naji Chu's story shows what happens when Vietnamese culture steps confidently into the spotlight. Born in Luang Prabang, Laos, and shaped early by displacement and refugee life, Naji arrived in Australia in the late 1970s, carrying stories, flavors, and instincts that would eventually reshape how Australians thought about Vietnamese food. Her journey began in 2007, with a small and scrappy catering business serving Vietnamese-inspired canapés to corporate events and private functions. This was food with one foot in tradition and the other in modern presentation, and Australians loved it. By 2009, that energy crystallized into Mishu, a fast casual concept that felt completely fresh at the time. Mishu didn't sell nostalgia, it sold accessibility. Vietnamese street flavors were packaged into a tuck shop-style format that made sense for CBD lunch breaks, millennials on the move, and people who wanted bold taste without white tablecloths. The brand expanded across Sydney and Melbourne, and even crossed borders with a London outlet in 2013, a rare move for an Australian-born Asian food brand at the time. By the early 2000s, Mishu was pulling multi-million-dollar turnovers, running multiple locations, and employing large teams. Naji became a visible cultural figure, not just a restaurateur, but a bridge between Vietnamese heritage and mainstream Australian food culture. Of course, real entrepreneurship includes bruises, but Naji scaled her way up through every thick and thin. In 2017, Mishu entered administration during a tough hospitality cycle, reminding everyone that scale brings pressure. Instead of retreating, Naji decided to recalibrate. In 2021, she returned with Lady Chu in Potts Point, an upscale Vietnamese-French fusion concept that leaned into refinement, storytelling, and depth. Her exact net worth stays private, but her influence is undeniable. Naji Chu helped move Vietnamese food from cheap eats to cultural staple, opening doors for countless others in hospitality. So why is she in this list? Because she proved that Vietnamese-Australian success doesn't have to stay behind the scenes. Sometimes it gets plated beautifully and served to the whole country. And while Mishu brought Vietnamese culture into lunch queues, the next name on the list built wealth without ever needing a storefront at all. Number 6. The Podetti family, bridging Australia and global talent. Lynn Podetti's story feels almost tailor-made for the modern economy, even though it's rooted in something very old-school, necessity. Vietnamese-born and raised in Australia from the age of 9, Lynn grew up understanding responsibility early, including navigating life as a single mom while building a career. Instead of chasing traditional corporate ladders, she noticed a shift happening quietly in the background. Businesses needed help. Talented people overseas needed opportunities. Technology had finally made distance irrelevant. In 2015, Outsourcing Angel officially launched, though the idea had been forming long before that moment. The model was simple but powerful. Outsourcing Angel matched businesses, many based in Australia, with skilled virtual assistants and remote professionals across the Philippines and other regions. This wasn't cut-price labor or faceless outsourcing. It was structured, ethical, and designed to last. Australian leadership set standards, global talent delivered execution. From a small initial team, the company grew to over 80 offshore contractors supporting hundreds of clients. Public figures around the business describe it as a 7-figure operation, meaning annual revenues comfortably in the high, hundreds of thousands to millions of Australian dollars. Lynn herself doesn't flash numbers, but the scale speaks clearly enough. Beyond revenue, the impact is tangible. Outsourcing Angel claims to have helped more than 500 business owners reclaim over 20 hours a week, while also reinvesting into charitable and community initiatives. Lynn has been recognized among Australia's most influential Asian Australian entrepreneurs, including 40 under 40 accolades. Why does she matter? Because her story expands the definition of Vietnamese-Australian wealth. This is neither the property nor its produce. This is a global digital infrastructure built from Sydney, powered by empathy, systems, and timing. And as we move further up this list, you'll notice something fascinating. The higher the influence climbs, the quieter the flex becomes. Number 5. The Tran family. Old money producing power at Sydney markets. What if wealth had a smell? If that was a possibility, the Tran family's wealth would have smelled like cold storage at 4 a.m. diesel forklifts, and fresh coriander still damp from overnight delivery. This is the kind of wealth that grows quietly in the background while louder players come and go, burn out, or sell too early. The Tran family's roots trace back to rural Vietnam before 1975, where farming wasn't a career choice but rather survival knowledge. When the family patriarch arrived in Australia in the mid-1970s, he didn't land in a boardroom or even a shopfront. He started with manual labor, learning the rhythms of Sydney's markets from the ground up, long before Asian produce became trendy or profitable. The real inflection point came in the 1980s, when family reunification allowed the business to scale. More hands meant longer hours, tighter logistics, and eventually, control over supply rather than dependence on it. By the time the second generation stepped in during the 1990s and early 2000s, this wasn't a hustle anymore. It was an institution that needed professionalization, not reinvention. Their wealth, conservatively estimated between 10 to 20 million Australian dollars, doesn't sit neatly in liquid accounts. It's locked into Sydney Market's wholesaler licenses, which are scarce by design, cold storage infrastructure, and something far more valuable than real estate: trust. In produce wholesaling, margins are slim, often hovering between 3 to 7%. But volume is relentless. When you're moving massive quantities of Asian vegetables week after week, predictability becomes power. The Trans specialized in items mainstream supermarkets once ignored: yam beans, rau ram, Asian basil, seasonal vegetables that Vietnamese households depended on daily. For years, they operated inside a demand bubble that few outsiders even noticed. Vietnamese grocery stores multiplied, restaurants needed consistent supply, and the Tran family sat right in the middle, controlling dock access, timing, and credit relationships. Now, this is a true representation of Vietnamese-Australian old money, without any modern branding or reinvention arcs. Just logistics, leverage, and longevity. As someone once said about them at the markets, the Trans supply the people who supply the restaurants. And in this industry, that's where the real power lives. Now, our next story begins in the same world, but takes a completely different path. Number 4. Bao Hoang family: how Vietnamese food went fully mainstream in Australia. Let me put it this way. Before rolled, Vietnamese food in Australia mostly lived on side streets, handwritten menus, and places your parents swore were better than the city ones. Then suddenly, boom, pho and rice paper rolls were staring back at you from Westfield food courts, airports, and CBD lunch strips, right next to burgers and burritos. That shift didn't happen by accident, and Bao Hoang was the one who engineered it. Bao Hoang grew up in Australia as the son of Vietnamese refugees, surrounded by traditional food culture at home while being fully immersed in Western, fast casual dining outside it. That dual exposure mattered more than people realize. He not only loved Vietnamese food, but also understood how Australians consume food. Speed matters. Consistency matters. And if you can't explain what you sell in 5 seconds while someone's already half looking at sushi, you've lost. Rolled was built backwards from that insight. Instead of starting with tradition and trying to scale it, Bao started with systems, centralized recipes, prep processes that didn't depend on one auntie knowing the right balance. Menus engineered for speed, supply consistency, and broad appeal, even if that meant softening certain flavors to survive national rollout. Purists complained. Customers multiplied. Today, Rolled has more than 125 stores across Australia, making it one of the largest Asian fast casual chains in the country. Bao's estimated wealth, sitting somewhere between 50 to 80 million Australian dollars, comes from ownership stakes, franchise fees, royalties, and brand equity that extends far beyond any single store. This isn't restaurant owner money, it's platform money. The real breakthrough was location. Vietnamese food didn't just move upmarket, it moved mainstream: shopping centers, airports, food courts where decision time is measured in seconds. Suddenly, pho wasn't ethnic food, it was lunch. Why does this matter? Because Rolled proved Vietnamese cuisine could compete nationally without losing its identity entirely. Bao took Mum's cooking and turned it into a corporate operating system. And whether you love it or critique it, That's a level of success very few ethnic food founders ever reach. And interestingly, the next story shows what happens when wealth isn't built on taste buds, but on minds. Number 3. David Chiem and family. Education, property, and the power of intellectual capital. If Rolled is about feeding the masses, David Chiem's story is about shaping how the next generation thinks, and doing it in a way that compounds quietly over decades. This is wealth that doesn't shout, doesn't trend, and doesn't panic when markets wobble. David Chiem migrated to Australia as a young man, educated locally, and later expanded his reach internationally. Instead of chasing obvious opportunities, he focused on something most people underestimate until it's too late: early childhood education. Not as a charity, not as a lifestyle business, but as an asset class. MindChamps sits at the premium end of early education, blending psychology-backed curriculum with branding that speaks directly to education-conscious, middle to upper-income families. Parents who might cut holidays, delay upgrades, and skip luxuries will still pay for what they believe gives their children an edge. David built an entire business model around that reality. His estimated net worth, conservatively placed between 80 to 120 million Australian dollars, is spread across MindChamps centers, intellectual property, licensing agreements, and property-linked education assets across Australia and the Asia-Pacific. This isn't one-country wealth. It's geographically diversified and cycle-resistant. The machine works because it stacks defensiveness. Education fees generate cash flow. Property under the centers captures appreciation. Licensing and franchising extend reach without ballooning overhead. Education plus property is one of the quietest wealth engines around, and David understood that early. Australia played a crucial role here. It was the proving ground, a market trusted enough to build credibility before exporting the model internationally. Once validated, MindChamps scaled across borders, turning intellectual frameworks into repeatable infrastructure. Why does David Chiem matter? Because he represents a different Vietnamese-Australian archetype altogether. This is wealth built by monetizing how people think and learn. It's slower, steadier, and designed to outlast trends. And now, we move from classrooms to something much bigger: land you don't drive past but fly over. Number 2. The Lee family. When Vietnamese capital quietly took over Australia's north. Here's a fact that usually stops people mid-sentence. One Vietnamese-linked family controls hundreds of thousands of hectares of land in Australia's Northern Territory, along with around 60,000 head of cattle, and most Australians have never heard their name. That's because this kind of wealth doesn't come with storefronts, billboards, or branding. It comes with maps. The Lee family comes from an agricultural and food production background, but instead of staying small or sentimental, they deployed capital strategically through Australian-registered entities into Northern Australia's pastoral land. This wasn't a vanity play. It was patient, calculated investment at institutional scale. With an estimated wealth between 100 to 150 million Australian dollars, the family's power sits in land control. Around 700,000 hectares across the NT places them among the largest Vietnamese-linked landholders in the country. The cattle are the operating business. The land is the long-term asset. Northern Australia mattered for one simple reason: optionality. Historically, lower land prices per hectare, proximity to Asian export markets, and decades of underutilization created opportunity. Vietnamese capital stepped in during periods when local farmers were debt-stressed or exiting due to climate volatility. No emotion, just timing. These stations focus on breeding, herd development, and long-term value creation rather than quick flips. They operate under Australian law, employ local workers, and integrate fully into regional supply chains. This isn't absentee ownership. It's embedded, operational capital. But as impressive as it may sound, the Lee family's wealth still falls shy of the family sitting at number 1, where the scale, influence, and story get even bigger. Number 1. Tan Le and family. Brain tech, global influence, and the future of human-machine interaction. All right, if the rest of this list felt impressive, this is where it quietly changes gears. No farms stretching across horizons, no food courts packed at lunchtime, no property portfolios humming in the background. This story lives somewhere else entirely, inside the human brain. And yes, that's exactly why Tan Le sits comfortably at number 1. Tan Le was born in Vietnam in 1977 and left the country as a child refugee, eventually settling in Melbourne. Australia didn't just become her home, it became the launchpad. She studied law and commerce at Monash University, which already tells you she had range, but what really set her apart was momentum. In 1998, she was named Young Australian of the Year, and not long after, she found herself speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos. An invite list most people don't crack even after decades of success. From the beginning, her trajectory leaned global. In 2003, Tan co-founded Emotive alongside neuroscientists and engineers who shared a wild idea. What if brain-computer interface technology didn't stay locked inside military labs and universities? What if regular humans could actually use it? That question alone put her years, maybe decades, ahead of where the conversation is now. Emotive builds EEG-based brain-computer interface headsets that read electrical signals from the brain and translate them into usable data. Not vibes, not affirmations. Real signals that map cognition, emotional states, and intent. Products like the Emotive Epoch and Epoch X are used in neuroscience labs and universities worldwide, while lighter models like Emotive Insight are applied in AI training, gaming environments, and mental health research. This is scientific infrastructure, not lifestyle tech. Here's where the money gets interesting. Emotive isn't chasing hardware margins. The real engine is intellectual property. Hardware sales feed users into subscription software, cloud-based data analysis, enterprise licensing, and developer platforms that allow third parties to build neural applications. Layer on top a serious patent portfolio covering brain signal acquisition and non-invasive neural interfaces, and you get long-term defensibility that most companies can only dream of. Tan Le's personal net worth isn't public, but estimates north of 150 million Australian dollars are reasonable when you consider founder-level equity in a deep tech company sitting at the crossroads of AI, healthcare, and human-machine interaction. Brain-computer interfaces are projected to become a multi-billion-dollar global industry, and today's giants, Neuralink, Meta, DARPA, are arriving well after Emotive laid the groundwork. Australia matters here. Tan is an Australian citizen, educated entirely in Australia, and much of her early credibility and leadership foundation was built here before scaling globally. This wasn't a detour, it was the base layer. Why does Tan Le close this list? Because she represents the ceiling, a shift from labor to capital, and then from capital to intellect. While others built wealth from land, food, or infrastructure, she built it from ideas, patents, and the human brain itself. She didn't just build a company, she built technology that quite literally listens to thoughts. And these were some of the richest Vietnamese families that made it big in Australia. Which story impressed you the most? Let us know in the comments. And for more such interesting peeks into the lives of rich, take a look at Global Status.